Hello and welcome to another Capitol View webcast from the Northeast Mississippi Daily Journal. As always, we are joined by Daily Journal Capitol Bureau Chief Bobby Harrison to talk about the latest happenings in state politics. Bobby, what's going on down there today?
Oh, just all sorts of unusual stuff, Chris. We had the museums open this weekend. Had some snow, a lot of snow actually, and so
Yeah,
and then we had some news break today. So it's just it's another day in the capital city.
another day always. I know
Yeah,
it's never dull for you. I guess I failed
yeah.
to introduce myself. I'm Chris Kiefer, managing editor for multimedia here at the Daily Journal, and as I said, we'll talk through state politics. As Bobby said, the story broke today about John Moore, a member of the Mississippi House from Brandon. Is that correct, Bobby?
From Brandon.
From Brandon, who
Yeah.
had been House Education Chair. Anyway, he had resigned on Friday, citing health reasons. Word came out today that he was also being investigated, or was about to be investigated on allegations of sexual abuse, and so
Or sexual harassment. I mean,
sorry, sexual harassment. So we can talk on that a little bit. We'll also talk about the story that Bobby had last week about just more efforts to fight the state opioid epidemic, and there's been a lot, and there's been a task force, and they kind of announced a new campaign last week. We will talk about that, but first, I guess the biggest story of the week, certainly of last weekend, was the opening of the two new state museums. We've talked about them a lot. That's the Museum of Mississippi History and the Civil Rights Museum. Bobby had kind of been there and previewed them, but now they're open, and it was, I guess, a grand ceremony on Saturday afternoon that you attended, correct?
that's right. It actually began a little. It was supposed to begin at 11, but because of all the machinations with the president's visit, it really got started about 11:40. The public ceremony did, and it was a nice event. Kind of chilly, too chilly for somebody from South Mississippi to be out in the cold that long, unless you're up on a deer stand someplace, I guess. But it was a nice event, well attended. Probably about a little less than 2,000 people there, and it was a nice 200th birthday celebration for the state of Mississippi. Of course, our bicentennial celebration was actually the following day on Sunday. Was our 200th birthday as a member of the United States of America as a state. Not counting those few years, unfortunate years in the 1860s when we were trying not to be a member of the United States of America.
Right. I guess they those days, who would have expected they wouldn't have expected to get to this point, I guess. But anyway, Bobby, I guess the biggest story out of that turned into the president's visit, when that kind of word of that kind of came out middle of last week, and it led to some people to boycott the event. John Lewis, I guess, being the biggest congressman from Georgia and a civil rights icon, who was supposed to be a speaker at the event. Benny Thompson, Mississippi representative in Congress, was also among them, as well as Ray Mabus, former governor of Mississippi, former secretary of the U.S. Navy. Just kind of talk us through that whole thing. I know in the end, what it turned out, that President Trump didn't speak at the event. He kind of took a private tour at the beginning, and I guess his remarks seemed complimentary of the museum and of the civil rights movement. But just kind of take us through all of that.
Yeah, it was. That's one of those stories, Chris, where you kind of wish you had the fly on the wall, and you knew all the real story. I guess it broke last Monday on CNN first that the president was likely going to be attend Saturday's opening of the two museums. The two museums, of course, we should point out, are the Museum of Mississippi History, and then the Mississippi Civil Rights Museum. They're located in one big 200,000-foot building. They're two distinct museums combined by, they share a lobby, gift shop, ticket office, and those types of things. But they're two very distinct museums that the state built. Spent about $90 million building, and something we all should be proud of. And it came out Monday that apparently Governor Bryant, who considered himself a close ally of President Trump, had invited him in a private conversation to attend the grand opening, and it was likely he was going to do that. And as the week progressed, it became clear he was planning on coming. And the protest began, especially as it relates to the Civil Rights Museum. Chris, there's people who feel that the president have said things that the president has said things that have not been sensitive toward race relations, you can, there's a litany of comments that the president made through the years that have been perceived as not sensitive to race relations by many. And I guess it kind of culminated, I think it was Thursday, with, as you said, John Lewis, who was scheduled to be a speaker. He's a congressman from Georgia, but more importantly, he's also was a key player in the civil rights movement in the 60s, was arrested in Mississippi as part of the Freedom Riders who, came in the 60s to help end segregation in the state. He had his skull cracked up at a march in Alabama. He said that he would not attend the ceremony if he was going to boycott the ceremony. He urged people later on to visit the museum. So I think that's an important point that should be pointed out. And then Thursday night, lo and behold, the governor's office sent out a schedule of events, and the president was not on the schedule to speak at the public opening of the museums. As it turned out, the president came to town Saturday morning, toured the museums privately with I don't know, a small crowd of people who were invited to participate in that event inside, and then made some comments that were carried live on TV, but they were not made to the public outside. They were made inside the museum. As far as the public outside, unless you knew, if you had not been following the news, you would not even know the president was in town. I mean, he came in. The people, who attended a public event didn't know he was there. The protesters who came to protest him, they didn't, they didn't see him. And he left, and then the public event started. So it was kind of a bizarre thing. I mean, if you think about it, obviously the president, I don't begrudge the fact that the president, when he travels, it takes a lot of money. It takes just unbelievable amount of money. For instance, the interstate between the airport where the president landed and the museums, the interstate was closed for the president to travel on it. I mean, there's all sorts of special arrangements that occur when any president comes to town. But I just think it was interesting that he came to town, spent about 15 to 30 minutes touring the museums privately. This is a 200,000 foot building, so you can't do much touring in 30 minutes. And then he spoke briefly to a small group of people and left. So I guess the flip side, some people say that gave the museum some attention they would not have otherwise received. So from that aspect, some people might think it was a good thing. Other people, were disappointed that he was here, but he came, and it happened, and now the museums are open. And and as I've said many times, they're really, both of them are really special. The Department of Archives and History has done a tremendous job, creating those museums, and it's something the entire state should be proud of. So if you get a chance, come to Jackson and tour them. Interestingly, Chris, let me say one other quick thing. The Kellogg Foundation gave $1 million that at Saturday's opening that's supposed to be used to ensure that every student in the state, as during their 9th grade year, gets gets to tour the museums, because I think it's important to especially as it relates to civil rights, to know the history of your state and the history of the state, the good and bad and the ugly, if you will. And so that's a good thing the Kellogg Foundation did, and some other people are also helping with that effort.
Yeah.
Other groups.
Yeah. Going back to the Saturday event, Bobby, and of course you were there. What impact did the whole thing? I mean, did you feel like it took any air out of it? Did the protests overshadow things? Do you feel like the crowd was smaller? Do you feel like it added? I mean, do you feel like there was any impact from this whole backstory of the president coming and taking a private tour and everything that kind of changed the dynamic of things on Saturday? Or did you feel like everything still kind of went on as it would have?
I think, obviously, you mentioned, we talked about John Lewis. I mean, that, it kind of changed the dynamics. He'd been a long time scheduled to be one of the speakers, but, and you saw some, Great America, Make America Great hats scattered throughout the crowd. And then you saw some people who, with other things protesting the president. But no, I mean, it really didn't change what happened during the public ceremony, Chris. I mean, Phil Bryant, the governor, spoke and did a good job. Roger Wicker, U.S. Senator from Tupelo, spoke. Former Governor William Winter spoke. They all said for the most part appropriate things. And the key I think was, Myrlie Evers,
Right.
the wife of Medgar Evers, who was, of course, the civil rights leader from Mississippi, who was assassinated in 1963, and he plays his story plays a key part in the Civil Rights Museum as well as many others. But I think it's safe to say that he's one of the one of the real icons, one of the real leaders in terms of Mississippians as it relates to the civil rights movement. Obviously, she was a speaker too, and she did. I mean, Chris, I would urge everybody if they get a chance to go back. You could probably find her speech on a YouTube video or something and listen to her speech. I mean, it was an outstanding speech, and and I was told that she did it. I didn't know that Saturday, but she did it. Off the top of her head, she had no notes or anything, and it was just a powerful speech. It was a powerful speech in sense of what she said the Civil Rights Museum and the other museum means to her, but it also was a powerful speech in how she talked about her native Mississippi, a place that she acknowledged that she hated for a time after her husband was killed, but how she had come back and then embraced Mississippi. She donated Medgar Evers' papers to the Mississippi Department of Archives and History back in 13 or 14, 2013 or 2014. And those are important papers. And so she played a key role in the creation of these two museums. And so, her speech was kind of the highlight of the day. And it's interesting, Chris, and this is strictly theory on my part, but, there's perhaps we'll never know exactly why, everybody thought the president was going to be a speaker during the public ceremony. And then at the last minute, we learned that he wasn't going to be. And, one thing that's interesting is that, Myrlie Evers had said in a story in the New York Times that, that she wasn't going to boycott the opening because of the president's visit, but she planned to, I forget the exact quote, it was a powerful quote, that she had a breath in her body she was going to address during her speech some of the stuff he said through the years. And I think maybe some people thought it's better if the president be on the stage with her, where she might say something that, the president has, and he's proud to say, somebody criticizes him, he hits back a lot harder than what he was criticized. So I don't know, that would not have created a very good optic if he had, was saying real, nasty things about Myrlie Evers. So maybe that was part of that. I don't know. And I may get letters or nasty phone calls for even hypothesizing that. But, that's a, up until that Thursday night, though, less than 48 hours before the event, everyone thought the president was going to be speaking at the public event, but as it turned out, he was not a speaker there. So I mean, I don't know what the thinking was there, but something happened.
Yeah, sure. That's interesting. Bobby, I know you've been inside the museums before and you've talked about that. Did you go inside them again on Saturday? And specifically, what I'm wondering is, was there anything, the last minute details as they kind of finished the museums up that surprised you that you hadn't seen?
No, I didn't go. I mean, I had an opportunity to go in Saturday, but I mean, I spent a good bit of Saturday afternoon working on my story, and because of some other commitments, I didn't go back in. I plan to go back in, take a tour, just pay my $12 and go back in
Right.
soon. Because what I'm anxious to see that I have not seen yet, we talked about it, and I know I've written about it several times, but I hadn't actually seen it. It was one of the last things that was put completely in place for the opening. Was the highlight of the Civil Rights Museum is this gigantic light sculpture in the middle of it that as it plays this little light of mine, which is kind of a sort of a synonymous with the civil rights movement, and as people get closer to it, it plays it louder and it lights up, and there's all sorts of stuff there, sort of in recognition of the people who played a key role in the civil rights movement. And incidentally, I think, and I haven't had a chance to read Caleb's story, I don't know if he addresses this, but I think some way, and I'm not exactly sure how the sculpture is going to work, but I think Jack Reed from Tupelo, the late Jack Reed,
Mm-hmm.
who was played a key role in the civil rights movement in the 60s as he then chaired the Mississippi Economic Council. I think some way his story is portrayed in that whole uh,
Oh, wow.
exhibit. So that's a Tupelo angle. Of course, Jack Reed Senior was a Tupelo businessman and community leader. Was a Republican gubernatorial candidate in the late '80s. But his probably maybe in some aspects his lasting mark on the state was as the chairman of the Mississippi Economic Council in the '60s when there was a lot of talk about uh, sort of the state abandoning its public school system. He stepped forward as the leader to MEC and got the MEC on board in supporting the public schools and saying, that the public schools should continue and adhere to federal guidelines. And so that happened at a key time, and he took a lot of courage to do that at that time. And so his contribution is recognized in that museum.
Yeah, and you mentioned Caleb did have a story. It didn't talk about it. It said that Jack Reed Sr. was featured in the museum, but the story was specifically about looking at Tupelo's story, or kind of as Mississippi celebrates his birthday, looking at kind of the unique story of Tupelo and the Tupelo model and Tupelo way, and of everyone kind of coming together in this poor community that didn't have a lot of natural resources and becoming what it became. Anyway, it's a good story. I recommend for anyone who hasn't read it yet to check that out. That was also in Sunday's Journal, as was Bobby's story covering the museum openings, and a story from Mississippi Today about President Trump touring the museum. I guess one more thing on that very point before we move on, Bobby. Anything about President Trump's remarks or appearance that surprised you? Kind of when all was finally said and done.
No, I was actually outside the museum. I wasn't one of the pool reporters who was in the museum listening to President's remarks. I mean, but you could actually listen to them on TV. I think some of the local television stations and probably some of the national cable channels carried them live, at least portions of it. But as I understand them from the news reports, he said the appropriate things and praised museums, praised the efforts of those who led the civil rights fights in the 50s and 60s, and praised Medgar Evers by name, and so no, his remarks were not controversial at all, and he. As I said, he was there. Just a little side note, Chris. You could tell while the people such as myself outside the museum waiting for the public event to begin didn't know what was going on in that museum, we could tell, at least if you were paying attention, you could tell when he left because the snipers who were on the roof left. So when I knew when those snipers left that the president was no longer in the area.
In the building. Huh. Moving on to another topic, Bobby, that you wrote about last week. We've talked a lot before about this effort to battle the state's opioid epidemic. And of course, Governor Phil Bryant had a task force. One of the recommendations that came from the task force, I guess, kind of got started, came to fruition last week. And that is this effort called Stand Up Mississippi Campaign. There's a website that they've launched for it. I'm trying to find that URL, and I'm trying to find here all the agencies that were involved with it. It's the Department of Mental Health, Departments of Public Safety and Human Services, Bureau of Narcotics, Board of Pharmacy, and then on the federal level, it's the FBI and the DEA, Drug Enforcement Agency. I guess kind of walk us through a little bit about this latest effort.
Yeah, it's kind of a public relations campaign, and part of what they're doing is trying to as I understand, combat the stigma with drug, addiction, and specifically the opioid addiction, which is affecting so many different elements of life, not only in Mississippi but nationwide. And Mississippi is just kind of part of what's happened nationally as far as that epidemic. And it's kind of highlighting that this is a sickness, and and trying to get people to kind of not look at it as a sickness you need to get help for, and then also just just highlight this to get people to to watch out if if you have a loved ones or something that you need to try to strive to get help for them, and and that, I know that can be a difficult thing. Somebody that won't help, it's hard to make them get help. So it just kind of highlights the epidemic and the fact that there's it's not something to look at it as a sickness and not a sort of something that is a stigma for that person or for that family that's involved with the issue.
Sure. That website, let me pull it back up, is standupms.org. And it's a pretty slick design. And I guess there's a lot of different resources on the website. It's kind of got a resource for people and encouraging people to share their story. It's got links to treatment options. It's got some statistics. It's got some opportunities for it's got stories that other people share that you can kind of read through, as well as opportunities for speakers to various groups, and you can request that. So you can sign up to get email alerts and so forth. I know you said some of it is just kind of remove the stigma and try to get people to get help, I guess, when they're having trouble and dealing with some of the issues. Part of this too, Bobby. So first of all, I guess this effort, it comes from a federal grant that is also paying for the drug that to I guess reverse the effects of
reverse an overdose
of an overdose, right? And I know one of the things that the legislature did last year was allow people to get a standing prescription of that, including even for a family member. So you can kind of have on file. My impression is that part of this effort is also to kind of think through some more possible legislative solutions to propose in the upcoming session. Is that right? Is there anything that you kind of feel is imminent?
Yeah, well, I think some of this stuff costs money, Chris, and I don't. There's just as we talked about, the state doesn't have a lot of money right now, extra money laying around. But I do think that there'll be some more legislation, or at least during this session, as far as maybe even while not make a try to not to stigmatize those impacted by the opioid epidemic, but by the same token, maybe looking at those who make the drugs so readily available, making the penalties tougher against them. This past session, as you thought, they made it easier to acquire that drug that does reverse the effects of an overdose, and then also they're trying to there's been efforts by the legislature and also by other state agencies to create databases and other tools to call there's the illegal opioids, but there's also the prescription opioids, which is also a big thing. So there's efforts to create databases so that those a doctor can go online and find out somebody's already had 3 or 4 prescriptions of a particular type of pain medication. Maybe they don't need any more. So there's all sorts of efforts to combat that. And and as that's going on, one thing that came out from last week's press conference is there's been more opioid overdoses this year than there were last year in Mississippi. I forget the numbers, but it was so it's a growing problem, and I feel certain that there'll be some other proposals come out of the 2018 legislative session.
Yeah, let's see. I'm trying to find that number. Let me switch the camera over. I think it's 200 and I lost my window again. I think it's 250 deaths for 250 for the current year. Last year there were 211 deaths, and as your story noted, both of those numbers are very likely underreported just by the nature of how opioid deaths are reported. There probably were actually more. Last thing, Bobby, before we I guess close for the day, we talked about it a little bit at the top of the story. But the John Moore, member of the Mississippi House, who had been House Education Chair, I resigned suddenly at the end of last week, and just kind of talk us through that a little bit.
Yeah, John Moore was he's from Rankin County, an influential member of the House. Been here for several terms. I can't remember off the top of my head how many, but he resigned last week. He cited health reasons. He had some pretty serious heart surgery earlier this year, but had returned to the legislature. But as it turned out, stories broke this morning that the speaker's office was had committed to launch an investigation related to allegations of sexual harassment against John Moore. It's not clear what those allegations are or how serious, but John Moore, based on those, as that investigation appeared to be about to happen, he unexpectedly resigned. So it's safe to. I mean, it's hard not to assume that the two are related. And as the speaker pointed out, that he said once the Moore resigned, there was no reason for them to continue with the investigation. But it appears maybe you could surmise that maybe Mr. Moore resigned so those allegations would not be made public, but as it turned out, they're being made public anyway. As of yet, last time I checked, Chris, before we came online here, none of the specifics of the allegations have come to light, so we don't know what they are. But it was kind of it was an example of what's happening on a national level, hitting us here in Mississippi. That'd be from a policy standpoint, it'd be the House Education Committee would be a key appointment the speaker to make to fill that vacancy going into the 2018 session. That's one of the most powerful committee and most coveted committee post in the legislature. John Moore is also a key member of the Appropriations Committee, handled the budget for education. He was a significant member of the legislature, and of course this comes at a time where there's still efforts to rewrite the funding formula for the local school district. So that also is significant in this news.
Yeah, so it'll be interesting to see what happens in terms of how they fill that education chair, and I guess even in terms of the special election, it seems like it would be hard. We're getting late in the year; it's gonna be hard to have that filled before the legislature starts, right at the beginning of January.
No, it won't be filled before the end of January, but I assume, it won't be filled before the session begins, but I assume that, not too long after the session begins, the speaker had to fill that education committee post because it's just too important a post to leave vacant for too long.
Sure. All right. Well, that does it for another episode of Capitol View. As always, we thank Bobby for joining us down from Jackson and filling us in on the latest in state politics. And we thank you for joining us. You can catch Capitol View again every Monday at 2 o'clock. Watch it live at djournal.com. You can also catch the replay there or as well as on our Facebook page. So until next time, take care.